Journalism is its own culture and it's got its own ideas about how we do things. One of the things that drives me nuts is that journalism depends a lot on tropes that are developed from fiction. So, for instance, if we're going to write a story about some sort of scientific topic, we have to have this compelling protagonist who, battles all odds and et cetera, has internal and external conflicts, blah, blah, blah. But that's not how science is made. Science is a, it's a social enterprise that takes a lot of people to do it. So, that presentation in and of itself is inaccurate.
Welcome, Wild Ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, we have Nathan Gilles. Nathan is a journalist and science writer based in Washington State. Nathan specializes in climate change impacts and adaptation strategies, documenting how phenomena like hot droughts and extreme heat events are transforming landscapes and threatening tree species across North America and globally. His writing has appeared in Earth Island Journal, Sierra Magazine, Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. He is a contributing editor at Columbia Insight, a nonprofit news site focusing on environmental issues in the Pacific Northwest. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast.
Wow. Thanks for having me, Josh.
Well, I'm really glad you're here. And the reason I invited you on is because you put out a couple pieces about what we call wildfire pretense logging. The term officially is fuel reduction logging. These articles were in your publication, Columbia Insight, and I thought they were pretty fascinating. And in fact, you did a deeper dive on these topics than I've seen in terms of science writing and investigative journalism. I was like, I got to talk to this guy. So that's why you're here. Maybe you can really just quickly go over a couple of those articles. Obviously people should read it, and we'll link to it so you don't have to explain the whole articles. But just tell us about that, if you could.
Yeah. Oh, so the first article you're referring to is basically. Back in November of last year, a lawyer I know at Wild Earth Guardians received a public records request from the Forest Service related to Region 6, which is the Pacific Northwest, and how the region had been meeting its timber targets. So this lawyer shared the documents with me, and pretty much right off the bat, it was clear that the agency was using various tools and authorities associated with the wildfire crisis to help meet its timber targets. As I started to do more investigating, specifically just to try to understand what some of the arcane terms were, it became clear that the agency had also basically said the same thing publicly as well, if maybe not as candidly.
Great overview. So just the two articles that I was referring to this is Columbia Insight. The Forest Service is using the threat of wildfires to meet timber targets. And then the other one is a fuel break project near Mount Hood could remove old growth, critics say. So what was the most challenging part of digging into this topic that frankly most journalists either can't or won't?
I mean, it's kind of boring to read, page after page of internal documents. I mean, it's a little bit like trying to learn a foreign language, because there's a lot of obviously jargon involved, and there's a lot of translation that you have to do, and it just simply takes a fair amount of time to do that. Yeah, I would I would say that was probably the biggest obstacle involved. The other, unfortunate obstacle with this story is we couldn't get the Forest Service to comment for it. We had it back in we had hinted back in November that we were going to be writing something, and reached out to the Forest Service PR department back then, and reached out again in January and then also in February to get interviews, and we were turned down both by the national office and by the local Region 6 branch. And I do wonder if that has to do with just the current shakeup in Washington, for lack of a better term, and just concern on the agency's part to not receive bad press, as it were, because I felt like this was the sort of thing that we would have gotten interviews for in the past. And that certainly would have made it, I think, a stronger piece. I mean, I think it's pretty good as it is. Both pieces are pretty good. but there were certainly some elements that we were not able to delve as deeply into because of, again, we would need the Forest Service to help explain some of the jargon terms, and then also to provide their own perspective on what they think they're doing.
Well, that's pretty unfortunate. I mean, it's not like you're some wide-eyed radical such as myself with an agenda. You're a journalist, you want to get to the bottom of this issue, and you're saying, hey, entity that is moving this forward, can you help me understand this better? And it's radio silence.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and I hope that changes sometime soon. But I mean, we were given one of the stories, actually the last story, one of the explanations we were given for it is that that the agency was currently reviewing any executive orders from the Trump administration to determine whether or not, how they should proceed, essentially. And so that was their reason for your term radio silence.
I see. Okay. Well, I definitely encourage people read the article. The article says it all. We don't need to talk about the article that you all should be reading. So read that article, read both of them. Excellent work. My listeners may know that I did work for a while as a investigative journalist and environmental journalist, science writer in between my advocacy. And, I don't need to go into all the details with that, but I can tell you that this is just one of the better written pieces that's out there, and it doesn't come across as any form of advocacy. You're just trying to report on the details. So yeah, read these articles, folks, if you haven't already. But I know you've written other articles, and I'd like to hear what some of the pieces that you felt were some of the most pivotal, or the ones that you're the most interested in, if you want to talk a little bit about those.
Well, I mean, I think the current story for Columbia Insight, and I'm happy to go further into it if you want to. We can talk about some of the details if you have any like probing questions about some of these tools and how they work in these various authorities. We can certainly talk about that. In terms of my other work, I mean, the stuff I'm most proud of is the work I've done looking at the effects of extreme heat on trees, and specifically how it's kind of hurting our forests on both ends, essentially slowly drying them out. And then in the case of extreme heat events, like we had here in 2021 in the Pacific Northwest during what we call the heat dome, we had trees that the term was they basically scorched. I mean, I think that's actually a term from one of the studies that I read at the time, or that came out after the event. And I mean that is certainly it's very concerning. I mean, I initially learned about this work because I went to the Ecological Society of America conference and sat in on a talk of scientists, kind of a roundtable where they were discussing this research, and the scientists in the room were concerned, and scientists tend to downplay things a little bit. They don't like to jump to conclusions, but most of them were very concerned that we're reaching some critical points with temperature. They're going to have some extreme effects on our forests in the future, and that we're also having them right now. So we're having tree die-offs essentially everywhere, and when we're not having die-offs, we're having growth declines where trees are just simply getting thinner over time because they have to close their stomata so they don't lose a lot of moisture to the atmosphere, and in the process they don't take as much carbon in, and that means that they not only don't get larger, but they also don't have that carbon to build immunity to some of the things like insect attacks and other things that are currently happening. So it's unfortunate, and I've certainly seen it here in where I live in Washington State. We had just outside my backyard, this little forested area where we live. We had a number of Western red cedars that died, and they're just absolutely gorgeous trees. They're just beautiful, and it was mostly juvenile trees that died, and they died pretty consistently after the 2021 heat dome, and that's another reason also why I got interested in the topic.
Yeah, that is certainly alarming. It's a topic I've been tangentially aware of, but haven't looked into really closely. So your description of that, the stomata, yeah, I had not heard of that before. That's really fascinating, and yeah, that's scary. And I guess one of my biggest concerns, of course, is that the Forest Service, their answer to everything is just logging more. So I'm sure if they get to just do more clear cutting, they'll fix it all. So, but yeah, but that's,
I think that's an open question. Yeah, for sure.
well, that's their answer to everything. But that's really interesting. I'm definitely going to look more into that one. I haven't read that article of yours yet. Definitely encourage some of our listeners to read that as well if you're interested in these topics. And that's something that isn't certainly on people's radar as much, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it was hard to get it published. It's hard to get science writing published. For any number of reasons. Certainly because there's a barrier to entry with when you're trying to pitch a story about a topic to an editorial staff that might not be familiar with it and why it's important. Um, so I mean, I was very pleased that Earth Island Journal was published that story, and actually this we did another version of that story with the Associated Press through Columbia Insight, and they both published, and that was great to work with those guys and get that out to a larger audience.
Yeah, I think there is an audience for nature-based science, however you want to look at it. I think maybe, do you think maybe that sometimes the editors they underestimate the audience, or do they appropriately estimate the
I
audience?
don't know. I don't know. I have no idea.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I think that's fair. I don't know that they have the data to say one way or the other, but I mean, maybe they do, maybe they don't. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's an open question, but something I did want to ask you because I know we don't have a lot of time is I wanted to ask you in general about communicating to journalists because our listeners know a lot of what we're doing around what we're calling wildfire pretense logging, whatever, the wildfire issue, the forest issue, is to communicate to journalists. And of course, we are providing peer-reviewed studies. We're actually providing a lot of Forest Service studies and a lot of the findings that the Forest Service itself is not actually promoting, and they're kind of just looking away from. But that aside, I would be happy in many cases if just the reporters let the world know that millions of acres of logging is planned for the state. For example, there's a project here in Colorado in the Pike San Isabel National Forest called the Lower North South Vegetation Management, blah, blah, blah. And to my knowledge, it's the largest logging project ever proposed in Colorado, 116,000 acres. And I haven't been able to get one media outlet to do one mention of that project. And I say to them, ignore everything we're saying, say it's the most awesome thing that's ever happened. Just please tell people that this is happening and it's just dead air. Meanwhile, I have been able to, over a period of frankly years through this campaign, to get journalists to start reporting on some of the local concerns with this one particular county and all the fuel reduction logging they're doing. That's clear cutting, cutting some of the oldest trees, over 200 years old growth trees, and kind of just ignoring the public. So over time, that's been snowballing a bit, but it's still been really just uphill battle. So I guess my first question is, what is the reluctance and how to overcome that?
Well, I mean, I think part of the reluctance is just simply that it's a complicated topic, that maybe has a technical barrier to entry that would be difficult for some journalists to tackle. That's probably one. Two is probably what's called the problem of concision, where we have to write these really short things, but they have to be rigorous. And this is something I struggle with all the time because my stories tend to be kind of long. But I feel like that's necessary to try to establish a case, and not lose some of the important details. And yeah, I would say that those are probably the two big issues. And maybe it's just not on the radar because it's not considered a worthy topic. I mean, that's really a question for a lot of for whatever editors, because they ultimately have the choice of whether or not something goes through or not.
Yeah, regarding the last point, and I'm open to a lot of the possibilities because I just want to try to address the issue in whatever way. So whatever barrier there is, I want to try to overcome it. But in terms of it not measuring up to news, I'm particularly contacting journalists who have written on wildfire, on climate change. So it is in their wheelhouse, but there's just something weird about this, and there's no way you can speculate this, and you probably won't answer it, but I'll just put it out there. Do you think sometimes there's just almost an agenda at play, or a looking down on the idea of environmental advocacy?
You know, perhaps, but I think probably the more likely answer is that it's just simply cultural. I mean, journalism is its own culture and it's got its own ideas about how we do things. You know, for instance, one of the things that drives me nuts is that journalism depends a lot on tropes that are developed from fiction. So, for instance, if we're going to write a story about some sort of scientific topic, we have to have this compelling protagonist who, battles all odds and et cetera, has internal and external conflicts, blah, blah, blah. But that's not how science is made. Science is a, it's a social enterprise that takes a lot of people to do it. So, that presentation in and of itself is inaccurate. And I think there's other aspects like that as well. I mean, I think it's a really hard time to get science writing published, even though there's a lot of interest in it from specialty presses, but those are kind of hard to break into. The problem that we need to do, though, is to have more of that at the local level. But again, you get into the problem there of the barrier to entry being expertise. And although no journalist would ever want to admit this, we're frequently the dumbest people in the room. We're the ones who have to start from zero and then kind of figure stuff as we go along. So.
Well, you're generalists, right? You have a breadth of knowledge, not necessarily some expert level depth. That doesn't make you the dumbest person in the room.
I don't know. I think it does in some cases. I really think it does. And I think that's an okay place to be. It's an okay place to start from a position of that you recognize your own ignorance, because then you know how far you need to stretch and what you need to do to get better.
Yeah. In fact, what I always said about myself when I did do science writing was I did have to dumb the issue down for it to go through my dense skull. And in a sense, that was my skill, because then I could simplify that to get it out to the public without, watering it down, without distorting it in any way. But I don't immediately just pick up on it. I'm like, all right, can you, explain it to me as if I was in fourth grade, and then I can communicate to other people as if they're in fourth grade.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's certainly true. I think. I mean, you do have to you have to simplify, you have to dumb it down, and then I've had constant fights with editors, not at Columbia Insight. Columbia Insight's been unbelievably flexible with me, but about how much science I can fit into a piece. Because I want to try to push the envelope, not simply because um, I want to show off or something like that, because I think it's cool. I think the natural world's cool, the physical world's cool. It's interesting to learn how things work and that they have, physical limitations that they have to obey. Um, and when you do that, when you start to think in those terms, then you start to see the world differently, and it's kind of a transformational effect on for myself as a writer, it's certainly been true, but I think it also happens to readers as well. But that value is, it doesn't always mesh with some of the values of journalism per se. And so this is maybe a little off topic, but I thought about this because we talked on the phone briefly before we did this interview. And it got me thinking about Karl Popper, and Karl Popper is this philosopher of science, and he's got this he's got this idea that he explores in one of his books, where he talks about this idea is called the doctrine of the manifest truth. And it's this concept that basically all we have to do to understand the truth is simply to unveil it, to reveal it. This is Veritas, the Roman goddess. When she's naked, of course, that's when we see the truth, right? And that's kind of the basis of most journalism. It's certainly the basis of a lot of liberal and democratic thinking. And in Popper's ideas, it's in his conception, I should say, it's an example of a bad idea influencing a good one. We want these things, and we want democracy, liberalism, and the rule of law, and all these other things. But that's based on the fact that individuals can understand what's going on if they're presented with the truth. The problem, of course, is that the truth is extremely hard to come by, and facts don't speak for themselves. So when we receive facts, we have to find a way to frame them for people to make it understandable. And that requires an extra step. And I think journalism in general tends to like the stories that fit to the doctrine of manifest truth. It's this idea that we have an agency that's behaving poorly or something like that, and we just remove the veil and look, we can see what's going on. But I think the reality is that the world is a complicated place, and it takes a lot of time to break down all the details.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And I also think it was quite enlightening for you to say that in terms of the tropes, in terms of they're looking for a lot of times people who write stories, protagonist versus antagonist. So I write fiction. So that's what you have to do with that. And I remember
Right.
years and years ago when I was doing advocacy and I was talking to a journalist, I'm like, yeah, here's the issues. And they're like, okay, cool. So where were you born? I'm like, who cares? Like, this has nothing to do with me. But then I realized, no, they want to have this human face on it. So, I mean, this would be strange for me to be asking you this as a science writer, as somebody who has been a science writer, who is into the science. Should I just, and advocates such as myself, focus less on the science with these journalists and just make it into some sort of human interest story?
I mean, maybe that's what would fly. But the thing is, when you actually start to break down the science, there's always a logic to it, right? There's always a path that it has to follow. And one of the things I really like to do is just to review studies. So, some really good advice I got years and years ago from a mentor of mine was just to sit down and read the science, even if I don't understand it. So just, and a lot of journalists don't do that. So you sit down and read the science, and then you just kind of let it wash over you, like much like doing a big document story like this story. You just kind of like the previous story we're talking about with the timber targets. You just kind of let it wash over you, and then you try to kind of figure it up, and you pick up patterns as you go along. But the beauty of the science and what I really like about doing those study reviews is there's a clear logic to them, and that logic is a kind of narrative that you can follow from one end to another. To describe what's going on. Now, it's not always one individual who's like fighting against all odds, through creating this, going from step A to step B or whatever it is. But that is still there, and that is a structure that can be used to explain to people how this works. And I think that's also probably another problem that journalism in general has when presenting science, is we tend to present the findings. We don't present the process. The findings only have value because of the process. The process is what matters. The scientists aren't experts because of just I should say, let me reverse that. The scientists, what they say isn't true because they're scientists. What they say is true because they practice science, right? Because they have gone through this process. And I think we do readers a disservice when we don't explain how that works.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I'll have to ponder that one. I know you don't have much more time, so I don't want to keep you any longer. This has been really fascinating. But if you had a tip to advocates such as myself, assuming we're doing things in good faith, we just want to point out here are some of the environmental impacts. I'm an ecosystem advocate, right? That's my job is to say, well, did you consider this? What about this? It looks like this might be a piece that you did. So, what would be a tip for people like me, like the listeners, our member groups, partners, et cetera, to better communicate science and environmental issues to journalists?
I mean, ultimately, I'd like for people just to read the science itself. I mean, we do these little write-ups or whatever, and maybe they're valuable, maybe they're not. But I think it would be beneficial for people just to sit down and just learn it and just experience it. Um, in terms of what kind of advice I would give you, I have nothing. I'm sorry.
Well, how about this?
Sorry.
If somebody was pitching you a story, how how would you like to receive information? You probably wouldn't want, here's 150 studies. Would you want an
Yeah.
excerpt of a study? Would you want us to like, how would you want that to happen? And you're
Well,
probably
you
science
need
literate than most, though.
sure. Well, you need some kind of a narrative that I always think of it. It's a little bit like a scatter plot. You have to draw your line through it, right? And so you can figure out what's valuable and what's not. Um, and so I would find out what is that narrative through multiple studies and then present that, because that's the valuable part. And that's what I've tried to do in some of my other stories I've written too. And And it's pretty clear when it happens because one study just builds off another study and so forth. And all these people work together so they know who's doing what and so forth. And sometimes they agree and sometimes they don't. Um, but there is that narrative.
So in terms of that's actually very helpful. But I've tried a couple different approaches, and I have actually gotten some feedback in terms of, okay, that's just too much information. I can't go through all that. And then I target really localized studies, and they're like, yeah, you're just mentioning the same studies. And it's like, well, which do you want? Do you want, I can give you hundreds, and then there are like 6 local studies done in this landscape. So I'm providing those to you. I've gotten weird feedback in regards to that. So like, what makes the most sense? Like showing them a few studies, like a whole giant body? Like where should I, what direction?
That's a fair question. I don't know that I have an answer for that. Yeah.
Fair enough. But
Yeah.
so that's,
And not being an editor, I'm usually the person that gets shot down when I try to pitch certain things. So I don't I don't really know what goes through editors' minds sometimes. So
but would you rather receive 3 or 18 studies if somebody's,
I would rather receive a bundle. Yeah, I would rather receive a bundle.
so maybe it really does come down to advocates knowing the work of the journalist. I'm going to give them that information. And this person is doing a 2-minute TV spot. So maybe not so much.
Yeah, and I get, you can build relationships with people too. That always helps as well. And like you were saying, like no, what somebody's tolerance is for Arcania, like if they're willing to take the big pile of studies, then by all means give it to them. If they want the smaller ones, then you maybe do that.
Right. Because I'm just going, and I'll let you go in a minute, but I'm just going back to one particular journalist. We took him out to this whole hike that we led that had 35 people. He said he was interested in the science. He had been reading a lot of kind of industry agency funded stuff. We gave him a slew of independent stuff. And he finally told, he's like, I don't know how to make sense of the 2 different perspectives. So he just didn't write anything.
Oh, fair point. Yeah. Okay.
But he was candid. I appreciated him being honest instead of just going off the radar and us not knowing why. So, yeah, I always think about that and how to better do it. And I think a lot of the insights you provided here are actually going to help us to be able to figure that out. Because all we want to do is better communicate the information. Then it's in the journalist's hands. But I think that as advocates, we can do a better job. And that's why I think this was really great for you to come on and tell us about that.
Right. Well, if I were presented with that, you just present the dueling arguments. I mean, there's no difficulty in doing that. You just have, that's a conversation, right? That's something that's interesting. You have 2 sides that are arguing about different points, and then you find, what do they agree on? What do they disagree on? What is, and what is the validity of each of their assertions? And then you write on those grounds. That's how I would probably approach it.
That makes sense, but I think you're just a higher caliber of science writer than a lot of the journalists I've been interfacing with, and I don't say that to crap on them. I just think that's just the reality situation. You just have a better understanding of these topics than a lot of these journalists do.
Well, that's sweet of you. Thank you.
Well, it's just fact. That's an objective fact, I would say. But well, Nathan, thank you so much for coming on the Green Root Podcast. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Can people find your stuff in one spot by any chance?
Yeah, I have a website, nathangillis.com, which I'm really horrible about updating because it's not that interesting to update your own website. It's more interesting to learn new things. And I am on Blue Sky now as well. Although, again, I'm not a fan of tooting my own horn and spending a lot of time on social media. So I don't know what value that would be for most people. Certainly, come and check out Columbia Insight or columbiainsight.org. We're a nonprofit, and just see what we're doing and see what you think.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for all your great work.
All right. Cheers.